Bear with me.
Okay.
Okay, good.
So, okay, thanks. So we're now live. So hi everyone. Thank you
Hi.
for joining us tonight. We're here for a session on workplace health and safety, and we are joined by a special guest. I know that people will be still coming in, so I might repeat a little bit, but we're and also I should introduce myself. My name is Stacey Gomez. I'm a member of known as Legal Halifax Chipuktuk and our Migrant Workers Program. We also have Tabasa, who is supporting on tech. And we are very happy to be here with Rachel. I'm going to share a bio, a small description of Rachel to introduce her, and then I will pass it on to Rachel. And also just a reminder that throughout this session, you can send us your questions and your comments. And after the presentation, we will take time to answer your questions. So Tabasa, would you be able to bring up the number that people can text with their questions? Great, thank you. So the number is 902-329-9595 on WhatsApp. And you can send us your questions. We won't share your name publicly. We'll just, anonymously share your questions. Look forward to your participation at this webinar. And good night to you too as well, Andre. Great to have you tuning in. So without further ado, just to present Rachel. Rachel Barbour has been a worker counselor with the Office of the Worker Counsellor in Nova Scotia since 2015. The office was established by the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour in 2009 to provide assistance, education, and advocacy for workers dealing with workers' compensation or occupational health and safety systems in this province. Really happy to have Rachel here, and just to continue to collaborate with you. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks.
I'm really excited too, and I wanted to say hi to everyone out there. And I'm really looking forward to sharing some information about health and safety and how it is so important in your workplaces, and a little bit about how health and safety works if you're here in Nova Scotia, Canada, working. I have a slideshow, so I'm going to share my screen and I'll go through the slides. And when we finish those, at the end, I'll hopefully be able to answer any questions that you have about who I am, where I work and what I do, and about what rights you have when you're working here in Canada to be safe and healthy in your workplace. That's really important to us, and of course to you and your families, and we really want to prioritize that. And if there's anything at all that we can do, then that's what my organization is here for. So I'll share my slides, and we'll take you through them slowly. And I'm going to start with a little bit again about where I work, just so you know who I am and where I'm. In Nova Scotia, Canada, we have an organization called the Office of the Worker Counsellor. And our organization, as Stacey said, was set up by the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour. But most people don't know what the Federation of Labour is. It sounds kind of official, but it's not really official. The Federation of Labour is an organization that gathers all of the labor unions in the province of Nova Scotia together to advocate for changes for the workers of Nova Scotia. And part of what the Nova Scotia Federation of Labor wants to achieve is safer workplaces in our province where people are not getting injured or killed at work. And that's why they set up our organization. So my job as a worker counselor is to provide free assistance to anyone who contacts me, free and confidential assistance to anyone who would like some assistance if they've been injured at work with getting compensation for that injury, or if they're concerned about health and safety in the workplace and they're worried that they're being asked to do work that is dangerous. We would much rather hear from you if you're concerned about safety before we have to hear from you because you've suffered an injury. We love it when people call us about concerns with safety in their workplace, because to us, that means that we can prevent an injury from happening in the first place. So Stacy has all of our contact information, and if you ever did have questions or needed our assistance, you could certainly go through Stacy, and we'll work with her to make sure that you can get in touch with our organization if you need anything at all relating to an injury at work or making sure your workplace is safe. So today, I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of safety in the workplace here in Canada, so that you get a really good understanding of why Canada has the system of safety in workplaces that we have. So we'll talk about a little bit of history. We'll discuss the way the law in Nova Scotia deals with health and safety in the workplace. I'm going to explain the rights that you have as someone who comes to Nova Scotia or Canada to work. And we'll talk about something called discriminatory action, which is, if anyone is worried that their employer is going to punish them, then there's a process that you can follow to make sure that you're treated fairly and that you don't have to be afraid to talk to your employer about safety issues or to raise concerns with your employer or to take action. There's a process. If we have some time at the end, we'll do a little bit, I'll tell a few stories maybe and give you an idea of how all of the law and your health and safety rights can, what they look like in action. And then we'll stop and hopefully answer any questions that you have. So often people ask, why do we worry about occupational health and safety? Why do we worry about safety in the workplaces? Much of the work we do is safe, and really a lot of people believe that safety is up to the individual worker, that if someone gets hurt at work, it's because they weren't being careful enough. Well, at our organization, we don't believe that. We believe that it is the employer's responsibility to make sure that your workplace is safe and that you know how to work safely and that you have all of the tools that you need to be able to go to work and provide for your families and go home to your families at the end of the day or at the end of your stay here in Canada and be healthy and whole and be able to be there for your family as well as provide for them. So it matters because every year in Canada, 1,000 people die because of work. So they're being injured and killed in the workplaces. On top of the people who are killed at work, over 250,000 people in this country are injured at work every year. And those numbers are not improving. So one would think that with all of the modern technology that we have, we could start making our workplaces safer, but that's not happening. So the 1,000 workers that are dying and the 250,000 workers who are being injured, those numbers are just increasing every year. And it's simply not acceptable. Something that you should know is that migrant workers who come to Canada have a higher rate of injury than other workers here in Canada. And there are a lot of reasons for that, that we can talk about or that you may have questions about. But often, you're doing very difficult jobs, and sometimes you may be isolated, and often you don't really understand what your occupational health and safety rights are, because I'll tell you what, your employer is not going to tell you what your rights are. So it's our job and our hope today that will help you learn what rights you have under the law while you're working here. It's important, I want you to know that when you're working here in Canada, you have the same legal rights as anyone in this country to have a healthy and a safe workplace. It's really important that you know what your legal rights are and that you share the information about their legal rights, because we do not want you to pay for working here in Canada by having an injury and suffering because of the work you're doing. So hopefully we'll let you know what your rights are and you'll get a good understanding of them. We don't expect to make you an expert in occupational health and safety law. You don't need to be an expert. You just need to know the basics. And then you also need to know that if you need help or you have questions, you have someone to contact, and that there are people here who want to help you. So health and safety is very important to everyone. I'll tell you a little bit about the history here in Canada of how the current system of occupational health and safety came to be. I imagine, it's very similar no matter where you live. In the past, 100, 150 years ago, the Industrial Revolution came to Canada. And all of the small family-run businesses in small towns closed, and instead all of those people moved to cities to work in large factories. If they were working in farming, then instead of working on a small family-owned farm, they were moving to large factory farms where they didn't know who the owner of the property was, and the owner of the property or of the farm didn't know who they were. So things were changing, and a lot of heavy machinery was being invented and being introduced into workplaces. What happened was workplaces became very, very, very unsafe. And all of this heavy machinery, these large workplaces, employers who didn't know the people who worked for them, this resulted in a huge number of deaths and horrific injuries. And so many people were dying that it was called the industrial slaughter. when a worker was injured or killed at work, usually they were blamed for their injury or their death. And it was considered their fault. In order to get any kind of compensation, the worker or their families had to take the employer to court. So they had to sue their employer and hope that they would be able to get some kind of compensation. Because obviously, if someone is killed in the workplace, then that family has lost the breadwinner. And that family is going to need some kind of support. So the only way to get support and compensation was to file a lawsuit. Obviously, this was complicated because employers had lots and lots of money compared to the workers, and the employers could hire the very best lawyers to defend them in court. They also had certain legal defenses that made it easy for them to win if they were sued by a worker who had been injured or a worker's family after that worker had been killed. The defense that they used, they're sort of legal terms: contributory negligence, the fellow servant rule, and the voluntary assumption of risk. Sort of legal terms, but they're pretty simple. Contributory negligence just means if the worker did anything at all that contributed to their accident, their injury, or their death, then the employer wasn't responsible, and the employer did not have to pay any kind of compensation. The fellow servant rule meant that if any other employee in the workplace contributed to the injury or the death, then the employer, the boss, was not responsible. So if you contributed to your own injury, or if one of your co-workers contributed to your injury, then the employer doesn't have to pay any compensation. And then there was this voluntary assumption of risk, where employers would argue that when you accepted a job and you accepted money in payment for your work, then you were voluntarily assuming the risk of that job. So you were choosing to take the risky job and to take the danger in order to earn the money. And they said that that meant that as an employer, they weren't responsible. So using those legal defenses, employers almost never had to pay compensation to workers who had been killed or injured. For employers, safety was expensive, but lives were cheap. It was very inexpensive for them to bring workers on, to injure those workers, or even kill those workers, and they didn't have to worry about it. It was cheap for them because they never had to worry about paying compensation. It's interesting that if you work in a factory or if you work on a farm, most of the work that you do, most of the processes that are used in your workplace were designed during this time of industrial slaughter. And if you think about it, like, what does that mean? The fact that the way we do our work on a farm is the same as it was 100 years ago. What that means is that the work that you're doing was created at a time when your life didn't matter. So all of the work that you're doing is really very dangerous. And no one has really thought about how to make the work you do safer. That is going to be up to you, and we're going to help you do that. So what changed? We had this horrible system of workers being killed all the time here in Canada, and families being left destitute with no money and no way to support themselves. Why did things change? One of the main reasons for the change was a tragedy that occurred in New York City in 1911. And there were some factory workers who were sewing garments, and the clothing they were making were called shirtwaists. They were sewing these shirtwaists, and there was a fire in their factory. They were on the very top floor of the building, and they could not escape the fire because their employer had locked them in. So the employer had locked all of the doors in order to prevent people from taking breaks from work. And 146 garment workers died because of the fire and because they couldn't escape. And it was not something that the public could ignore because it happened in the middle of the day in the middle of New York City. And the public watched while these garment workers jumped from the building to try and save themselves. This is called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. And this event really upset the public and made the public demand that there be changes in health and safety in workplaces all across North America. Almost immediately after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, there were changes to the laws in Canada. And every province in Canada developed laws about health and safety in the workplaces. The law here in Nova Scotia is called the Occupational Health and Safety Act. It's a piece of law just like any other law you might know about, whether it's the criminal code in Canada or motor vehicles law, you need a driver's license and things. It's law, and it tells people what they have to do. And yeah, it's important that you know Nova Scotia has a law about occupational health and safety, and every other province in Canada has a similar law. So I'll be talking about the law in Nova Scotia, Canada. That's the province where I'm from. But the laws in other provinces are very, very similar. So if you needed clarification, if you weren't working in Nova Scotia and you were working in another province, the laws are very similar from province to province. So this will be helpful information. Here in Nova Scotia, the law is enforced by an organization called the Department of Labor and Advanced Education Occupational Health and Safety Division. That's a long name. Essentially, they are the Occupational Health and Safety Police. So they're the ones who enforce the law about health and safety in your workplace. We don't bother with their long name. We just call them the OH&S Division. And they are also there to help if there are issues with health and safety in your workplace. And we'll talk a little bit more about them and whether or not you need to contact them. In most cases, you can just contact me or someone who can answer these questions for you. Stacy is great at this as well, or she'll put you in touch with me. Here in Nova Scotia and really across Canada, they have this phrase that they use when they're talking about health and safety in a workplace. And the phrase they use is the internal responsibility system. What does that mean? The internal responsibility system is just jargon. And jargon, pardon me, jargon is a word or a phrase that's used by a certain group of people that outsiders usually don't understand. But it's a big word or it's a phrase that they like to use when they're talking about occupational health and safety. And it's important for us to know a little bit about it because it really sets up how health and safety works here in Canada. Internal responsibility essentially means that there's really no external responsibility. So internal responsibility means that employers are supposed to follow the safety laws voluntarily. Nobody is going to force them to do it. So although we talked about the OH&S division, really what they say is, okay, employer, you go on and you just follow these rules, and if there's a problem, someone can let us know. Employers are supposed to follow the rules, and workers like you and like me are supposed to make sure that our boss is following the safety law. The government in Nova Scotia, they will get involved. The OH&S division, the police that deal with health and safety, they'll get involved, but only as a last resort. So what that means is occupational health and safety in our workplace is up to us. That means when you arrive to work anywhere in Canada, nobody is looking out to make sure your workplace is safe except for you. So it's so important that we realize this is on us, it's our job, and we've actually been asked by the government here to sort of make sure we have healthy and safe workplaces. But how does that work, right? How does that work? How can we as workers really do anything about safety in our workplace? The employers are the bosses. They control the workplace. The employers can hire us, they can fire us, they control what we do, they control when we do it, and they control how we do it. So how are we as workers supposed to make sure that employers follow the safety laws? That's where we start to talk about the rights that we have under the law, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, that give us power in our workplace. So the power that we have as workers, and again, that you have wherever you're working in Canada, are these three rights. And these are some of the things I'm going to ask you to remember. You have the right to know, the right to participate, and the right to refuse. And I'll explain what those things mean because it's not really obvious, is it? So let's start with the right to know. Every worker in Canada has the right to know about the hazards that they may be exposed to at work. So if you work anywhere in Canada, you have a legal right to know about anything that could be dangerous to you or to someone else. The right to know means that before you start work, your employer is legally required to tell you what dangers exist in your workplace and how to make sure you can work safely. And I'd like you to take a moment to think right now about what are some of the dangers that you might be exposed to when you're at work, whether it's here in Canada or anywhere. Just think about those dangers And then think about how your employer could make sure that you know about those dangers. Because it's your employer's job. It's not your job to arrive in your workplace knowing about how everything works. It's their job to show you and to teach you. So your employer should give you occupational health and safety training. They should tell you if anything at all is dangerous in the workplace. They should teach you how to use the machinery, how to use, if you're dealing with chemicals, how to deal with them safely, how to use any equipment, personal protective equipment, maybe gloves or a mask, anything. And they should also explain what you should do if you've been injured. That should happen before you start your job on day one. Often it doesn't, but there is a legal requirement. So that's the right to know. What about the right to participate? The right to participate means that every single worker in Canada has a right to play a role in keeping their workplace safe. You have a voice in health safety. You can get involved. You have a right to speak up if you see something that's not safe and to ask your employer to fix it. It's really important that workers participate in keeping the workplace safe because the workers are the ones who know what's dangerous and who know how to make things safe. So your voice is really important. Talking to your employer, talking to your coworkers, telling your supervisor if you see something that is not safe. Those are all ways that you can participate in health and safety. I also wanted to mention really quickly that in most cases, your workplace should have either a health and safety committee or a health and safety representative. Any workplace in Canada, well, I won't say Canada, any workplace in Nova Scotia with more than 20 employees must have a health and safety committee. And that committee is formed of representatives from the employer and worker representatives. And it's their job to work together to make sure the workplace is safe. So if you go to work and you know that there's more than 20 people there, ask your employer, who's on the Occupational Health and Safety Committee? Because they should be able to tell you. If you only have a smaller workplace and there's between 5 and 19 employees, then they won't have a whole committee, but they should have a health and safety representative. And that means that the workers can choose someone to represent them for health and safety. And the law requires these things. Some of your employers may not have them, but the law does require that they have a committee or a representative. And if you arrive at work and you find out that there's no committee and there's no representative, then you contact us and we'll fix that for you. And workers get to choose who represents them. Just so you know, the employer doesn't get to choose people to be on a committee or to be the representative. The law says that it's the workers who get to choose the people who go to the committee or who represent them with the health and safety of the workplace in mind. This is an important piece that I really want to reinforce. The right to know and the right to participate are very important parts of keeping ourselves safe in the workplace. But perhaps the most important thing for you to know in most cases, if we're at work and our boss comes and says, hey, could you go do this for me? we don't get to just refuse. The boss is paying us, and we have to do what they ask us to, right? The boss tells us what to do, and that's why we get paid. One of the only times that you have the legal right to say no to your boss is if your boss asks you to do something that you believe is not safe. And this is one of the most important rights, and it's also one of the rights that many people don't understand, or it's the right that a lot of people are afraid to use. The right to refuse means that workers in Canada have the legal right to refuse work if they have reasonable grounds to believe that that work is likely to endanger them or anyone else. The right to refuse means that your employer can't force you to do work that you believe isn't safe. Your employer also can't force anyone else to do the work that you believe is unsafe. And it's important to know that your employer cannot punish you for refusing work for safety reasons. I also want to reinforce here that the only thing that matters when you are refusing work is that you have a sincere belief that the work is not safe. Sometimes your sincere belief may be wrong. Sometimes, for example, you may not be sure if work is not safe. There may be a chemical and you're not familiar with it, and you're worried that using that chemical may not be safe. Well, it could turn out that that chemical was actually safe, but that's okay. Maybe you were wrong and it was a safe chemical and you refused to work with it because you were worried it wasn't safe. But the law protects you even if you were wrong. The law protects you as long as you have an honest belief that the work is unsafe. And again, sometimes you may not know if it's safe, but you're worried. And that's when you have the right to refuse unsafe work. If you're refusing unsafe work, there is a process you have to follow. And it's important to understand a little bit about the process, because if you don't follow the process, it doesn't work. You know, you're not really telling your employer that you're using your legal right. So you refuse work. We'll talk about this now. Here's the when to refuse work. You should refuse unsafe work if you have reasonable grounds to believe that the work might be unsafe for you or for someone else. So if you're worried you might, injure a coworker, you can refuse to do that work. Reasonable grounds means an honest belief. It doesn't mean certainty. So you don't have to be certain that there's a risk. You just have to have an honest belief. How to refuse unsafe work is another important process. What's very important is that you remain at work. You don't get to just leave because you believe work is unsafe. You have to stay at work. You can go to a safe place. So if you are in an environment and you feel unsafe, you can go to a place where you feel safe, but do not leave the workplace. The way to refuse work is to report the situation to your supervisor. Your supervisor has to fix the situation to your satisfaction. So your supervisor doesn't get to just disagree with you. They don't get to just say, no, you're wrong. This is perfectly safe. Go do it. They have to fix it to your satisfaction so that you now feel that the work is safe. If they don't fix it to your satisfaction, then you report your concern to the Health and Safety Committee or representative. Usually the committee or the representative will make sure the situation is fixed. But even if the committee representative comes and says, hey, I don't think you're being fair, I think this work is safe, you can continue to refuse work. If you continue to believe that the work is not safe, then you can continue to say, no, I'm not doing it, I'm refusing under the law. If that happens, that's when we call the OH&S division. And their number is here. Now, I'll tell you what, you don't need to remember all of this. There is information available on the internet, but more importantly, if you get in touch with Stacy, she'll put you in touch with me, and I can help you with this process. I want you to know that you have the right to refuse work, and that you have the right to go to your supervisor and say you won't do it because it's not safe. But I also know this is a lot of information and you're probably not going to remember it all. That's what we're here for. We're here to help you if you ever encounter this as a problem. So that's the process we talked about. There are 3 steps. Go to your supervisor. If they don't fix it, talk to your committee or your representative. If they don't fix it, then you call the government inspector. Usually what happens if someone says they're refusing work is your employer says, oh, whatever, okay, you go do this other work. You go do the boring stuff. I'm just going to call Stacy over and I'll get Stacy to do the job, right? And depending on how brave or confident Stacy is, sometimes Stacy will go do the work even if she's worried about it too. Your employer can ask another worker to do the job, but they have to tell that person that you refused the work because you thought it was unsafe, and they have to tell the person that they also have the right to refuse. So if the employer calls Stacy over to go do the work, they have to explain to Stacy those things. They're not allowed to just send Stacy in to do it. How long does a work refusal last? Often people think that the work refusal ends when the work has been reassigned. So the employer might call Stacy and get Stacy to go do the job, but that's not the end of the work refusal. The work refusal ends when you can go back to work. It's kind of confusing, but ultimately the work has to be fixed to your satisfaction, even if your employer sends someone else to do it. And if that's not happening, then you call the OH&S division, and they will come and they will figure out if something needs to happen or if the work is safe or not. If you refuse unsafe work, your employer has to continue to pay you. They are not allowed to say, okay, go on back to the bunk. I'm not going to pay you. You can just, sit there and you're not going to get paid because you're not working. If you refuse unsafe work, your employer has to pay you. They can reassign you. So if you're not going to do one job, they can ask you to go do another one. But even if they don't find other work for you, they have to pay your wages while you are refusing unsafe work. This is a summary of the work refusal. And I would suggest, if you've got an opportunity, that maybe you take a screenshot of this. I believe this video is going to be available later on YouTube, and you'll be able to access it. So you can come back and take a screenshot. But this is just a good summary of the work refusal process. And this is something that can be really helpful if you just have it available and something happens at work and you're not sure what to do. So yeah, screenshot this. And really, if in the end, you need help, you can absolutely get in touch with our organization. Right now through Stacy, but at some point, Poor Stacy. I'll make sure that we have a WhatsApp available for you to contact us that way too. Discriminatory action, we're kind of getting low on time, so I won't go into it in very much detail, but I did want you to know that the law very clearly says your boss is not allowed to punish you for exercising your health and safety rights. So they're not allowed to do things like change your hours of work. They're not allowed to reduce your wages or withhold wages. They're not allowed to punish you by giving you the worst jobs. They're not allowed to fire you or send you home. And they're not allowed to threaten to do any of those things. If they take action against someone for exercising their health and safety rights, the employer can get in a lot of trouble. They can be investigated, fined, and shut down. So it would be very reasonable to worry about your employer punishing you, but it's actually, if you have our organization helping you and backing you up, we will do everything within our power to make sure that doesn't happen. Your employer is not allowed to do those things, and it's taken very seriously by the OH&S division if your employer tries. So your employer is not allowed to punish you if you're on the committee or if you're reporting a safety concern. They're not allowed to punish you for talking to me about health and safety, or if you were to call the safety division, the OH&S division, they're not allowed to punish you for that. They're not allowed to punish you for refusing unsafe work, and they're also not allowed to punish you if you had to testify in court, which you'll never have to do, but that's just something that the law says they're not allowed to punish you for. Now, if something like that was to happen, there is a process to go through. So if your employer threatened you or tried to punish you for refusing unsafe work, there's paperwork and things like that, but you don't need to worry about that stuff. What you need to worry about is getting in touch with Stacy or someone who can help you right away. So get in touch with Stacy or get in touch with someone who can help, my office, and there are a lot of other similar organizations out there. Get in touch as soon as possible, because if your employer is taking discriminatory action or punishing you for your health and safety activism, then things need to happen pretty quickly. And that's what we're there to help you with. We were going to go through a few stories, but I'm afraid we won't have time. So just to wrap up, before I answer questions, I wanted to give you a few reminders. Remember that every single worker in Canada has the right to be safe and healthy at work. There are laws in every single province here in Canada that protect your rights, and you have the exact same rights as everyone else when you are working in this country. In most cases, your employer should, or your workplace should have either a safety representative or a safety committee, and you should look into that when you arrive, because that can be a really helpful way to get active in keeping your workplace safe for you and for everyone else. I want you to remember your 3 rights: the right to know, participate, and refuse. And I also want you to remember that this is up to us, that the way the law is written, we're kind of the police of the safety in our workplace. That's why we've been given the rights to know, refuse, and participate, so that we can make sure that our workplace is safe. It's up to us, and you have people here who want to help you, and we'll do what we can to make sure that you have a good experience working in Canada, and that you get to go home to your family healthy and safe and uninjured. So that's my presentation. Took a little longer than I expected, but now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we will see whether or not anybody had questions or thoughts or feedback. If there's something that you'd like us to know.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks so much, Rachel. That was very informative. And yes, I do maybe want to ask Tabasa if you could bring up our number. So do you have any comments? What are your thoughts around the information that Rachel shared? Do you have any questions that come up for you based on, just maybe the sector that you're engaged in? If you have some any questions that we can share with Rachel while she's here with us. So the number you can send your questions to is 902-329-9595. That's our phone number, which a lot of you are in touch with through there. Feel free to just send us a message there. And also, I think, Rachel, when you were doing your presentation, maybe you couldn't see the comments over here, but I know people have been replying, saying hi. It's great to see people tuning in. Thank you, everyone. Look forward to your questions and comments. And maybe while we're waiting for some questions, I have a question for you. Okay, so let's see. Okay, perfect. So one question that I had raised to you in lead up to this presentation, I know we get questions from workers about when there's extreme heat out. I know last summer there was a few days that were extremely hot, and there was a question of what is the responsibility of the employer in this kind of a situation where we know that there are risks to workers of sunstroke, for example. I just wanted to throw that to you.
Well, the employers in Canada have the legal duty to do everything reasonable to keep workers safe and healthy. That's what the law says. The law doesn't say anything really specifically about heat as a hazard, but we do know that heat can cause a lot of injuries and even death. So if there is, certainly your employer is responsible to make sure you are safe. That doesn't mean they're always responsible to make sure that you're comfortable. So it may be uncomfortably hot and they'll still ask you to work. But if you're like me, it's really hard to tell where the line is between uncomfortably hot and dangerously hot. So if we think back to the presentation, we talked about the right to refuse. And if as a worker, you're concerned that it's too hot to continue working, you have the right to go to your employer and to say, you know what, it's too hot and I'm worried this is unsafe for me and for everyone else. So I would like to, talk to you about this. Maybe you'll be able to come up with a solution with your employer. Maybe your employer will say, hey, let's get some cold water down here. Let's make sure that there's some, you get lots of breaks and that you can take breaks in the shade, and maybe they'll solve the problem. But absolutely, there's no fine line. The only thing that matters in that equation is what you as a worker feel. If you're worried it's not safe, then you get to say, no, you're not doing it. Does that answer your question, Stacey?
Yes. Yeah, thanks a lot. And so I see that we have people that are still coming in, so that's great. And we got a question on WhatsApp, so I'm just going to listen to that and then come back. Actually, maybe while I am listening to this question, there's another question we have on screen here in Spanish. So the question is, if there isn't a safety, occupational health and safety committee, how can these problems be addressed?
Mhm. The only reason there would be no committee, or the only acceptable reason to have no committee or no representative, is if there are fewer than 5 employees at your workplace. So if your workplace does not have a committee or a representative, then your employer is breaking the law. So I would say, and I'm going to be honest, I think you will find that many of your employers don't have a committee and they don't have a representative. And it's not always because they're bad people. Sometimes they don't know the law and how it works. So I'm going to suggest that if you arrive at work and there are 5 or more employees, then you talk to your employer about a committee. And if your employer says, I don't know what you're talking about, then you say, I heard something about there needing to be a committee, and why don't I help you get one set up, right? So I would encourage you to get involved and talk to your employer and set up a committee. If there is no committee and no representative, and your employer does not want to work with you to get one started, then I would suggest dealing directly with your supervisor and talking to your supervisor about that. But also maybe contacting an organization that can help you, because I would be more than happy to go into a workplace and say, maybe you need a committee. We would try to find a way, and I know that's not easy too, but we would try to find a way to make sure there's a committee. Ultimately, if there isn't one, then you deal directly with your supervisor and your boss, and you raise your concerns with them. Good.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And so I have another question. And also, Tabasset sent you a WhatsApp if you could help out with that. Okay, so the question is that there was the death of a migrant worker who was struck by lightning. I believe this was in Quebec. And the commission, it sounds like labor standards, but it's maybe the Occupational Health and Safety Division in Quebec only gave recommendations. They did not give any, they didn't penalize the employer. Do you have any comments around that?
Yeah, it's really it's devastating when a worker is killed in the workplace. And it sounds as though, in this case, the Occupational Health and Safety Division really didn't do enough. Sometimes that happens when an employer has otherwise been a very good and safe employer, and it appears that this accident was, despite their best efforts to have a safe workplace. Sometimes in those cases, and the OH&S division will be less strict with an employer. The truth is too, though, that sometimes employers get away with these things, even though they shouldn't, right? It sounds like working in a lightning storm is incredibly dangerous, and everyone should have known that. And it's ridiculous that a worker was asked, and now that worker's paid with their life. So it really is terrible. And our organization is working to make sure employers are held accountable for maintaining safety in their workplace and for paying if they cause a death or an injury.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And yeah, we have a question. We'll get to, but maybe I'm just asking for Tabas's help around this, and then we'll loop back to it. So another question: were there any changes to occupational health and safety rules during the pandemic?
There were a lot of changes to occupational health and safety rules during the pandemic, actually. Um, in many cases, the pandemic required quarantine and isolation, and the Occupational Health and Safety Division enforced quarantine and isolation. Um, it wasn't really, it was different laws that were involved, um, but um, workplaces were required to take all of the social distancing requirements and to ensure people were wearing masks, and to ensure that people who were sick were staying at home instead of coming to work. So there were quite a few changes in Canadian workplaces for all of us during the pandemic. The laws weren't really updated, but they sure did make a lot of rules for employers. And I will say, overall, Canadian employers did fairly well. But I do know that in many cases, migrant workers were impacted the most by changes in COVID, because in a lot of cases, the employers weren't providing what they needed to stay safe and to maintain social distancing and so on. So it's yeah, it's challenging for everyone, absolutely.
Thank you. And so we have a question from a worker. What options are there if we are unsure the employers are aware of the laws, or if they are knowingly bypassing the rules, or what's prohibited?
Mhm. I will say in many cases where there are problems with occupational health and safety in the workplace, it's because employers are really unaware of the laws. Um, and, you know, the point is, or I think it doesn't really matter though whether they're unaware or whether they're intentionally bypassing the laws, right? The fact is they are responsible for following the law, and whether they're just ignorant of the law or they're intentionally bypassing the law, they are still breaking the law. So if your employer is unaware of the law, or if they're not following the law for whatever reason, then my first step would be to ask about it. Um, and if you feel like you can't ask about it, then I'll ask them about it, right? But that would usually be the first step, is to ask your employer. I heard somewhere that you need a committee, or I've heard somewhere that maybe it's not safe to be working outdoors during a storm, and talk to them. I like to think that most employers don't want the people to be injured or killed. Most employers want you to be safe. They just don't always know how. Um, so if they're ignorant, they need to learn. I will say a lot of your employers are very likely going to be ignorant. And in fact, you probably know more now about health and safety than your employers do, which is really kind of scary when you think about it. But many employers, it just doesn't occur to them um, that the work that they have responsibilities to keep people safe, and yeah, and that they can't pay you to take risks. They can't pay you to do dangerous work. That's against the law. They have to take every step possible to make you safe. I don't know if that answers your question, but absolutely, if there's an issue with the law not being followed, you let us know, and we'll do what we can to fix things.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And yeah, I'll throw in another question as we wait for people. If there's additional questions, feel free to send them to us on WhatsApp at the number 902-329-9595. Okay, a question that I have, we've had some workers reach out to us about issues such as violence in their workplace. For example, being physically attacked or risk of being physically attacked. Those are the more common. We've heard from a number of workers around these kind of concerns. So I'm wondering, what is the responsibility of the employer in this kind of a situation?
Your employer, violence in the workplace is a very common workplace hazard. And it's unfortunate, but many people face the risk of assault or being threatened or being harmed by someone else in the workplace. And whether it's a coworker or a customer or someone in the community or your employer, you have the right to be safe from violence. So in any workplace where there's the potential for violence, the employer has a duty to create a plan to prevent violence. And there's a piece of law called a regulation about workplace violence. And it explains what the employer needs to do in order to prevent violence. And they need to do a risk assessment to find out, where people are most at risk. And they need to take a lot of very specific steps. It is absolutely your employer's responsibility to protect you from violence. And in many cases, for migrant workers, when you are living on the employer's property or in housing provided by the employer, then they're also responsible even when you're not at work. They're responsible for you while you are under their care, living on their property or in housing that they've provided. So if it becomes an issue even when you're not at the workplace, but it's an issue when you're at home, then you deserve to be protected from that.
Thank you. And I think also just to mention, I know that there's been some concern. I know that there's been at least one video shared that I've seen of some violence that took place against a migrant worker in another part of the country. And I know that's it's pretty alarming to see that is that's a risk. So thanks for addressing that question. And in terms of a risk like that, would it be the same steps that would be followed to inform your supervisor, for example, and then the Occupational Health and Safety Committee, and then the Occupational Health and Safety Division?
It absolutely would be. Those are the exact steps that we would take. Start with the supervisor, and if they don't do anything, or if what they do doesn't work. Sometimes your supervisor might try something, but it really doesn't help. So you start with your supervisor. If they can't help, then you talk to the committee or the representative. And if there is no committee or representative, then you skip that step. So you talk to your supervisor, the committee or representative, and then you go to the Occupational Health and Safety Division. There is someone available at the Occupational Health and Safety Division 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So you can call them and they are available to help you with your concerns. If for some reason you're unable to make a telephone call, then you can use WhatsApp to reach. I'm sorry, Stacy, I'm volunteering you for all of these things, but you can reach out to Stacy for now. And my organization is working on getting WhatsApp so that people have an easier time reaching us as well, because I know that access to the telephone isn't always easy for everyone. So we'll be working on that.
Okay, thank you. And maybe something else as an aside note, just to mention to people about 911, if there's an emergency situation where you want to get in touch with the police or an ambulance, or there's a fire, you can contact 911. I just want to mention that because I don't know, how widely people know about that, but just just a piece of information there. And then we have another comment. Okay. And I believe this is the same case that was referenced before. Donde, or is this a separate case? Okay, it seems like a separate case where a worker was injured and he was made to work with a worker, even though I think the other worker was had tested positive for COVID. So I'm not sure. Yeah, if you have any comments around that.
I have heard of that happening. That is, that's illegal, and you would certainly be able to refuse unsafe work if that were to happen. Presently, a positive COVID test, depending on which province you're in, generally means, I believe it's 5 days from a positive test before you're considered okay to be around other people. Sometimes even after 5 days from your positive test, you may still have symptoms, but it's considered you're no longer contagious. But if you're worried that someone you are working with has COVID-19, then I would certainly encourage you to exercise your right to refuse work, because that's not safe and you don't have to do it. I have heard of it happening, and I do know that, over the past several years, migrant workers have been put in some very dangerous and difficult situations when it comes to COVID-19, and that's not acceptable. Not acceptable, and you can refuse under those circumstances. And I hope that you do. I know that that's not easy, but I hope that you've learned some things in this session that maybe help you know that it's at least an option for you.
Thank you. And I know one concern that's often raised by workers is that if they raise an issue, that they may not be called back in the future, and that would have a big impact on them. And so I just want to kind of loop back with some of the processes that you mentioned. Is it possible from your perspective to do them anonymously?
Some of them, absolutely. There are ways to do everything anonymously. You cannot refuse unsafe work anonymously, obviously, because if you're refusing, that's pretty clear to everyone. But absolutely, if you have safety concerns, you can contact the OH&S division and report your concerns anonymously. You can contact our organization and we'll do what we can to make sure that your concerns are addressed. We do know people who work at the OH&S division, so we can contact them and have conversations off the record with them, because it's absolutely everyone's goal that as a migrant worker, you are welcomed and cared for and kept safe while you're here in this province or in this country, and we'll do whatever we can to make sure that that happens, because I know that, you know, the reality for many migrant workers is it's very difficult to advocate for yourself, and it's very difficult to take those steps. And, you know, we'll do whatever we can to help.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think that's thanks for highlighting that. One other question I have, maybe a last question. So we hear about workers who, in their work, they have strain, and there may be like kind of, if you've been doing the work for a number of years, that maybe kind of longer term impact. So I wondered what if there's any rules around that in terms of occupational health and safety.
Mm-hmm. So absolutely there is, because ultimately safety issues are not always immediate, right? When we think about safety, we think about dangers like lightning or being assaulted, something that's in our face and that could happen and have immediate consequences. But many of the safety issues that we deal with, especially safety issues in agriculture, are more of a long-term concern. So things like repetitive work, where you're doing the same movement again and again and again, and it can start to wear down your joints. That's a long-term safety hazard. Sometimes on farms they're using chemicals, and you don't know what kind of effect those chemicals will have over the long term. The safety laws are available for those long-term hazards as well. So if you are concerned about repetitive work or the long-term consequences of the work, then you can refuse unsafe work. But more often than not, we would, you would be encouraged to try to work with your employer to address it and to make sure that the work is safe, both now and in the future.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And thank you so much for your time. So I think we're winding down. So yeah, thanks everyone who tuned in. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to write to us and we can share the questions with Rachel. Once again, we're here with Rachel Barbour with the Office of the Worker Counsellor. And they are a great organization. We're happy to work with them. And if you have any inquiries for them, we happy to pass those along. And up here on the screen is our contact information. So you can always reach out to us there. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Thank you everyone who was with us, and best of luck.
Thanks.
Thank you, Stacey.